How can data and HR coexist?
So data and HR, I think, have coexisted for a very long time, if not since the beginning. You know, people have tracked promotion rates, who's hired, who leaves the company, but only recently have people started to think about the way in which they should coexist and how to get to the insight or the answer to the question that you may want with the data that you have. And so what you can start to look at is what's the relationship between the different pieces of data that you have and the hypothesis that you may have or the outcome that you care about.
How does it benefit both the company and the employee? I think sometimes it's often thought of, okay, well, that obviously benefits the company, but is it mutually beneficial?
Yeah, I mean, at Google, we definitely see it as being mutually beneficial. So from the standpoint of the company, it's fairly straightforward. I think it benefits the company to understand what kinds of data to have, what the data that they need may be to make the decisions that they need to make. But from the standpoint of the employee, I think it's two main things. So first of all, if you know that the company is using data to make certain important decisions, I think it gives an additional layer of trust, that there's accountability and that things are being done based on more objective measures than just somebody's intuition or their gut, right? Another thing that I think is very important is once the employee has access to some of the data that the company may collect about various things related to the employee, they can use that to improve themselves, right? So employee surveys, manager effectiveness assessments, things like this, you can't improve until you know kind of where you need to improve, right? So it can help the employee take more action and become more proactive, take ownership over their tenure at the company.
Now, in terms of that improvement, that's a form of feedback, obviously. Are there particular tool sets or things where we're talking about the intersection of data that are useful there? I'm thinking of things like dashboards.
Sure. I mean, dashboards are great, right? So I think there are different levels at which you can use data to make decisions or act. So first you have to be familiar with the data, and dashboards are a great way of doing that. Just be conversant and understand kind of what the status quo is wherever you may be operating at the company. So in the context of HR, you know, how many employees are in your business unit? How many were promoted last year? These kinds of basic statistics that you know from a dashboard or things like this. But people can become numb to dashboards and metrics over time. So if you see the same metrics over and over again, you kind of don't care or you don't pay attention. And so what you really need actually is to disrupt, I think, the kind of more typical feedback mechanisms with insights based on questions that are relevant at that moment. And so it's pretty, I guess it's easy to become comfortable in sending out metrics regularly, but what you really want to do is think about what's timely and relevant and what data would speak to that.
So the contextual element is really
absolutely,
important there. Interesting. So my last question for you, and it's a weird one, right? But it's something that occurred to me as I was putting together questions for this. Do you see an opportunity for the quantified self movement, which is largely a health-driven movement?
Yeah.
Does that have a role in the workplace where people extend the acquisition of data through sensors into how to become better at their jobs?
I think that at a high level, absolutely. And so are we going to be putting sensors on people? Probably not, right?
Sure,
I mean, there's a little bit of a creepiness factor there. But the sentiment behind it, I think, absolutely. And so something that we do at Google, for example, is give managers an assessment twice a year from their direct reports and give them the feedback from their employees. And this is kind of a type of sensor, right? So something that they can do to measure themselves, measure their own progress, and see how they change over time. And there are, you know, a million things that you can do like that, and the frequency with which you collect that data could get down to an hourly basis on things that you may care about, right? So I think it's absolutely something that could be used effectively in organizations. Just some, I guess, caveats would just be, to what extent are people comfortable with that level of tracking when the quantified self tends to be something that is more personal. You don't necessarily have to share that, whereas much that happens in organizations becomes more public.
That's a good point. Good point. Well, thanks so much for being with us. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure.